Dr. Daniel de Haan is actually a physician, and he is working on the philosophy of cognitive neuroscience. He's actually part of a Faculty of Divinity project which embeds theologians and philosophers in science departments in the university. So he's embedded in the cognitive neuroscience laboratory at the university, working with neuroscientists and looking at the philosophical foundations of the work that they're doing. So he's going to talk on ascribing beliefs to brains.
Yeah. All right, thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate all the organizers inviting me. Appreciate all of you taking time to listen to a philosopher come in and, I guess, muddy the waters. It's often said that philosophers make really simple things really, really complicated, and then they make really complicated things really simple. So we'll see which one of those I'm going to be doing today. One thing to make very clear, and this will come out hopefully in one of the questions, this is actually a pro-neuroscience talk, okay? It's not a critical or skeptical neuroscience talk, despite appearances. What it's critical of is certain philosophical interpretations of neuroscience that are rather abundant, often throughout neuroscience. And I have a few little technical things I need to say, so some of them I'm going to actually read, and the rest of them I'm just going to present by talking. All right, so first off, there's some questions that you'll find that make headlines, something along the lines of, do brains have beliefs? Do brains have religious beliefs? Perhaps are the bits of the brain with ordinary beliefs different from the bits of the brain with the religious beliefs? What I'm going to sort of examine today, hopefully will lend itself to questioning these kinds of questions, as if these are actually fruitful questions or helpful kinds of questions at all. Questions that religious people and skeptical, atheistic people, agnostic people should all just find these questionable kinds of questions for guiding any sort of philosophical or scientific research, okay? Now, what I want to raise a puzzle with and a problem with is that there's a very common form of psychological ascription or belief ascription, namely attributing or ascribing psychological properties to bits of the brain, either by synecdoche, where you sort of take something that belongs to the whole and you say it about the part, or kind of metonymy, or you just metaphorically say, this part of the brain is doing, this is my free will part of my brain, this is my believing part of my brain, this is my imagining part of my brain. Or the brain simply is imagining, or the brain is believing, or the brain is, so these sort of literal ascriptions. These are found in philosophical literature, scientific literature, psychological literature, and a lot of just ordinary speech that we do all the time when we talk about brainstorming and these sorts of things. So it's just sort of entered the general cultural milieu. What I want to raise is some problems and some questions about this sort of promiscuous use of this kind of language and this sort of non-critical use of this kind of ascriptions of brain or ascriptions of psychological predicates to the brain. And one way to do this would be to go through and look at various cases in neuroscience journals where people are doing this and show that you could interpret this completely differently without ascribing psychological predicates to parts of the brain. This has been done very well by a number of philosophers and neuroscientists, and most notably Peter Hacker and Maxwell Bennett. And they have two books they wrote, one for philosophers called Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience, and another one written for neuroscientists and cognitive scientists called The History of Cognitive Neuroscience. Now what they say is quite controversial, but I'm kind of following a general sort of gist they start. I'm not going to go through all these experiments, but maybe during the Q&A we can talk about some of them if people have questions. What I'm going to do instead is talk about the rather rich, complex set of protocols and methodologically rigorous criteria that philosophers and psychiatrists and psychologists and comparative animal cognition psychologists will use when trying to suss out and figure out, do humans have beliefs? Do children or infants have beliefs or different kinds of second order beliefs? Or do apes, do dolphins, do dogs, do they have beliefs? And they follow these very, very rigorous methodological criteria and very complicated problems that they try to work through to figure out whether or not these animals have these kind of psychological capacities. And what I hope that shows is that while we have this set of protocols that we follow in these other areas that seem like these animals do have these psychological predicates, we don't seem to follow any of these sort of protocols whatsoever when we very promiscuously just describe psychological attributes of the brain. So these are the sort of two worries that I would have about this. One is that we don't really have a clear resolution yet to how, we know there's clear causal connections between cognitive conscious and conscious cognitive activities that we do with the brain. But we don't know exactly what these causal conditions are yet. So we can make lots of localization features and identify necessary conditions, but we aren't actually answering completely all the questions about what exactly is going on in these cognitive states and how they're related to the neural correlates. So that's one worry. And then the second is this comparative animal cognitive psychology. We're very, what exactly is going on there descriptively with respect to the cognitive states? Does the dog have a certain belief about the cat? Cat have certain beliefs about the dog? How would you suss out and discriminate the different kinds of cognitive states that these animals might be in? Okay. All right, so let's begin with a very slow, well, somewhat slow, but it should be a slow process. What we're going to do is rather rapidly walk through what exactly a belief is. So, starting with that, epistemology is a sort of philosophical discipline where we study what knowledge and belief are. Epistemology comes from the Greek word episteme, which is the Greek word for knowledge, and it also covers doxa, covering a belief. But knowledge is often thought by philosophers to be belief plus something else. So belief might be a belief that's true, or it might be a kind of belief that's certain, or it might be a belief that's rationally justified. And a common tag and very controversial claim in philosophy is that all knowledge is justified true belief. There's a very long history of arguing about whether or not this is what exactly a belief is. Despite all these sort of differences of opinion and agreement about what a belief is, typically it comes down to that belief is it's the default when claims to knowledge are mistaken. So belief might not be a kind of knowledge or might not be integrated in knowledge, but we often think if someone makes a claim to knowledge and then it's shown that that claim to knowledge was actually happened to be false or mistaken, then it turns out they just believed that such and such was the case. They didn't in fact know it. Okay? A lot of other things we could say about beliefs. Beliefs are drifted towards the way things are. So beliefs are sought to be cognitive states or representations, how we think the world is, how we think the world is arranged or ordered. And accordingly, then beliefs can be true or false as to whether or not they coherently and adequately represent the way the world is. They can be correct or incorrect. Some core characteristics of belief, looking at the etymology, but then also just looking at how we use them linguistically across languages, is that belief's core characteristics are things like trust, dependency, reliance, and reasonableness. So we can be held responsible for our beliefs. We make decisions about the beliefs. We are able to evaluate the evidence, to seek out further questions, to probe the evidence further. We can exclude certain data, exclude certain questions, not consider certain relevant factors that we should. So we're very much responsible for our beliefs. There's some that we aren't, but there are a lot that we are. And accordingly, they're also responsible for developing or just acquiring different types of intellectual and doxastic virtues and vices. So we actually talked about, some of these have come up, but things like credulity, gullibility, skepticism, these would be kinds of doxastic vices that we might develop. Cynicism would be another. Whereas virtues would be things like a pursuit of truthfulness, or trying to be truthful in the way that we go about our inquiry and the way that we form our beliefs. Open-mindedness, thoroughness with respect to the evidence and the data, not excluding relevant questions. Intellectual humility, intellectual charity, trying to really understand why we're rejecting the views that we're rejecting and understanding the reasons and evidence for those views, as well as intellectual courage to assert the truth when we really think we have justification and rational grounds for asserting something as true. With respect to the idea of trustworthiness and belief in terms of reliance, this brings in how beliefs are social and interpersonal. Can't remember exactly what it was. So, an important here aspect is that we don't just believe propositions, we don't just believe statements, we don't just believe information, but we also believe persons. We have faith in them and trust their word. We rely upon the experiences and knowledge of others, and this is because our knowledge, and even the knowledge of experts and specialists, is limited in countless ways. All historical knowledge depends upon the reports and testimonies of eyewitnesses and the accuracy of their chroniclers and scribes. And Christ says, "Thus, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And further, no scientist can perform all the experiments of their predecessors, can work out every theoretical assumption of their discipline, can verify every bit of data that's been discovered, interpreted, and recapitulated in the narratives that are presented in the lecture halls, or that are packaged very nicely in the bestsellers of popular science. The cumulative fruits of the massive information that we call scientific knowledge, laudable and praised as it is, it's nevertheless possessed by no one human person. It's instead distributed amongst individual specialists who know a lot about a little, and whose knowledge relies upon their beliefs and what others claim to know. So Aristotle's right. He says at the very beginning of his Metaphysics that all human beings by nature desire to know. That's quite right. However, Aristotle also knew that humans believe far more than they know. There's lots of things that we rely upon others for their knowledge, and all of our beliefs is what sort of on our trust in others and trust in the methods that they use and they employ, and the sort of mutual peer review and critical scrutiny that we apply that gives us confidence in their knowledge, but it relies upon our belief. Okay? An interesting thing about belief, too, is that the word belief, a nominal, hides the difference between the verb, so like to believe, the act to believe, what we do when we believe, from what is believed. There's some important ambiguities that then happen. We're not going to suss out all of those. But this first sense, to believe, is like as distinct from to know, to think, to remember, to imagine. And beliefs themselves can be, in this sense, they can be certain, they can be reasonably certain, they can be not certain. All of those are different kinds of beliefs. Beliefs can also be held firmly, loosely, passionately, tentatively, reasonably, dogmatically, groundlessly. And these are also connected to different kinds of doxastic virtues or vices that we might have that incline us to hold beliefs in these kinds of ways. Secondly, what is belief concerns the content or the object of a belief. And this is what individuates or specifies and distinguishes beliefs. So we might have religious beliefs, which concern religious matters. We have moral beliefs, which concern a set of moral platitudes or doctrines that we uphold or believe or try to live our lives according to. Okay, there's a great deal more that we could say about beliefs. And to actually suss out and get really clear about what we mean by beliefs, we would in fact have to do a lot more work. We'd have to look at a lot of different psychological literature as well as the history of philosophy and work through that. But we'd also have to scrutinize systematically all different kinds of interconnected concepts and ideas as well, like knowledge, thinking, memory, imagination, and figure out systematically how we're going to link all of these in a sort of regimented way. That would take a considerable amount of time. Just want to be said, but what you can see, what I'm trying to present to you is how complicated just figuring out what a belief might be, and how many disagreements there could be about any one of those points that I was just going through. And that if you were trying to develop, say, a test to try to examine behaviorally whether or not someone was believing something, thinking something, knowing something, or opining something, or had faith in something, how exactly would you develop, independently of linguistic reports, a sort of behavioral assay, a sort of test that could examine that and can measure that? It's going to be very, very difficult, if not impossible. And we're going to come to people who are trying to do that, especially with respect to non-human animals who can't report to us linguistically if they're in a sort of epistemic state of knowledge or thinking or believing with respect to something. But the first question is, we've said a lot about what beliefs are. This follow-up question is, do these beliefs exist? And it might seem obvious to a lot of us that we at least believe that we have beliefs, or that we're quite familiar with the fact that we're believing right now that we have beliefs, or knowing that we have beliefs. But there are a number of views out there that actually claim that we don't have any beliefs. This needs to be clarified a bit. One view would be called anti-realism about beliefs. So they're saying that beliefs don't exist, they're not real. A popular, well-known version of this is called eliminative materialism. This view claims that beliefs do not exist. They're only material brain processes. Now, to clarify what this means is they think that beliefs is a type of theoretical entity. The whole concept in linguistic practice and use of what a belief is part and parcel of a theory of psychology, namely folk psychology, common sense psychology, our everyday psychology we use all the time just to talk about how we're predicting and interacting with the beliefs of our friends and families around us. They think this is actually a theory, but it's a pseudo-theory or a folk theory. And like happy theories of old like alchemy and astrology, eventually folk psychology will be replaced by a new neuroscientific theory, and we'll get rid of these sort of things. So they don't think that beliefs are these sort of concrete realities, but rather they're theoretical postulate. And when we say someone is believing something, we're hypothesizing that they're believing something, using this theoretical construct of a belief. And so that makes maybe a little bit clearer as to why they don't think there are such things as beliefs, that in fact they're just neurological states. Okay? On the other hand, there are a lot of realists about beliefs. By and large, most philosophers tend to be realists about beliefs. They at least believe beliefs exist. Amongst them, some adopt this line of folk psychology. So they agree that beliefs and desire psychology is a theory. It's a sort of theoretical constructs that we develop throughout our life. and that it's in fact the most successful theory that we have. It's far more successful and it's far more efficient to say, why is the woman running after the bus? Well, because she believes that she has to get on this bus if she wants to get to the next destination, and so she believes also that she runs and catches, yells enough at it, the bus driver might stop and let her on. This is a much more efficient, parsimonious way, and it successfully predicts and explains what she's doing than any sort of neuroscientific account could ever be in terms of explaining the exact same behavior without appealing to beliefs and desires. Okay, so they think that it's actually the most successful theory. In fact, Jerry Floder says, if common sense psychology were to collapse, that would be beyond comparison the greatest intellectual catastrophe in the history of our species. We wouldn't be able to do even other kinds of science without this kind of theory of folk psychology. So how does the folk psychology get used or employed and deployed and operationalized in attempts to try to figure out whether human infants or non-human animals have different types of beliefs and desires? Well, there's a number of different strategies, and this is what's called theory of mind. What theory of mind or mind reading is trying to figure out is these are actually both horrible misnomers that really kind of muddle up what exactly this program of research is about. But what it's concerned with is trying to figure out behaviorally and set up tests. Can we see if a subordinate ape has beliefs about the beliefs of a dominant ape? Okay? Does a dog have beliefs about the beliefs and the desires of a cat? In other words, do they have some kind of metacognition or second-order beliefs? Not only their own beliefs about the world and other animals, but do they actually attribute beliefs to other animals? So that's what this sort of theory is about here. There's different inferentialist strategies. Adopting this sort of framework, they think that animals then have sort of something like an operative theory of mind. So they also have their own sort of functional folk psychology. And what animals are doing is they have developed a sort of theory about how different behavioral and environmental cues work in the world, and animals like us then make inferences, and they attribute and ascribe beliefs to other animals. Another kind of view thinks that this is way too complicated. There's no way this is what's going on when animals are, they don't have some sort of folk psychology, some sort of behaviorist folk psychology of their own that they deploy when they try to ascribe attributes to other animals. And so this alternative view is called simulation theory. What they think instead is that animals actually sort of analogize or sort of simulate for themselves, or even that's what we do when we ascribe attributes to other things, is that you think about, well, if I was running after a bus, why would I be running after a bus in a situation when the bus is getting away? Well, it's because I would believe that I need to get on that bus in order to get to my next destination. And so by analogy, I infer, or the animal infers, that this is what's going on inside of the head of this other person when they're thinking through what they're doing. So based on his, so both these views would say in different ways, based on his unusual behavior, we hypothesize and infer that Hamlet believes his uncle murdered his father, based on either simulating to ourselves, if I was behaving this sort of weird way with skulls, I might think so-and-so had killed my father, and so forth. Now, here's the woman running after the bus. Sorry, you didn't get to see that. And I'm not exactly sure what's going on down here, but so you can all try to simulate right now and figure out what kind of attributes going on. All right. On the other hand, there's a completely different perspective about belief attribution that's also a realist view. And this view often thinks that this whole idea of common sense psychology or folk psychology being a theory is a bit of rubbish. This is the view that these sort of ordinary psychological concepts we use of memory, of judging, of assent, of belief, of faith, opinion, knowledge, and so forth. This isn't any sort of theory of ours. This is just an ordinary set of concepts that we develop out of a set of behavioral capacities that we have, and that they're real, but it's not some sort of theoretical entity. Okay? And furthermore, we don't make inferences to the best possible hypothesis when we interact with others and explaining their behaviors. So when I attribute to my mother a set of beliefs and desires that I think explains what she's doing, it's not because I'm making a set of inferences, I'm not simulating something really complicated in my head. It's based upon a very basic sort of set of perceptual capacities that then integrated into higher order linguistic capacities. And that we don't perceive such mere behavior. Just to perceive behavior involves a set of sort of Gibsonian affordances, a whole set of range of complexities that are in the environment, that to even see something as behavior involves already taking it as an organism and immediately within that organism seeing it as doxastic behavior, cognitive behavior, perceiving behavior, observing behavior, searching behavior. So we just sort of immediately grasp perceptually as animals these, and we develop them later on in much higher order complex ways of articulating. I'm not going to have time to read all that. Sorry. So the idea here then is that behavioral criteria becomes integrated into the very concepts that we have for our belief ascriptions, for our ascriptions of desire, and so forth. And the thought is then that independently from these sorts of behavioral setups, which are integrated and constitutive to our very understanding of these concepts, there's not the sort of sufficient or adequate evidence required for ascribing beliefs or ascribing these psychological attributes to these animals or these humans. So let's see. Sorry, I was going to show you something about false beliefs. What comes up after years and years of working through different types of mind reading and theory of mind work on primates and dolphins and corvids is we do think, and there's a lot of arguments in different sorts of ways of interpreting this data, but at the end of the day, there's a lot of skepticism that still remains, and Pavanelli is a really well-known worker on chimpanzees, and this is sort of a quote of his expressing his sort of general skepticism about how little we can say. Some are still wanting to argue that the data reveals and provides evidence behaviorally that we can ascribe these robust behaviors, robust psychological attributes, but others are still indecisive. So the point about all the theory mind literature with all these other animals is that it's indecisive. So even when we set up all these advanced protocols, these very complicated, rigorous methodological criteria for trying to figure out whether animals or human infants have these different sort of attributes, we tend not to have sufficient evidence to be decisive in these debates where they clearly have all the kind of behaviors that look something like, or we might perceive as something like, having these psychological attributes. How very briefly then this comes back to the brain. The brain might well have behaviors. Whatever behaviors the brain has, it's not the sort of behaviors of reaching, of moving around in the world, of observing and exploring. But the brain, if it has anything that we might call behaviors, it's a set of action potentials, it's the diffusion of neurotransmitters across the synapse. There's a whole range of complex behaviors that we find in the brain, perhaps, but none of them are the kind of behaviors that are integral to the very concepts of believing, of desiring, of wanting. And so when we start using these concepts in this other sense, outside of the context of the ordinary behaviors that we ordinarily employ and deploy and ascribe these concepts to, we kind of completely lose the understanding and intelligibility of what we might mean by these. If we're saying these are the neurocorrelates, the causal conditions that are required for having these psychological attributes, there's no problem whatsoever. And I think that's exactly what neuroscientists are doing. But when we start saying that these in fact are acts of believing going on in this area of the nervous system, that visual perception actually is occurring in the visual cortex, I think that we've kind of lost sight of actually the intelligibility of how these concepts are used, and we're using them now in new technical ways that don't really make sense to us. Sorry for running over time, but thank you very much for your attention.
I wonder if the three, do you want to sit over there in the corner and as a trio, and we can address our questions into that corner? We might take this and pass it.
Sure.
Whoever's answering. So you can either address your question to an individual speaker, or you can make it a general one. So can we start with Joseph? Joseph? Who's got the microphone? Which one?
I'll go ahead and start for now.
Can you just pass it? No, can you use it?
Okay, all right. Okay.
Amy's got one.
So this is a question sort of geared towards Harvey. Before I do that, all these talks are fantastic. I think they deal with a lot of important issues relating to belief on a lot of different useful levels. But for Harvey, I've sort of got this perception, or belief, I guess you could say, that your idea is that there's a lot of things that can contribute to sort of how you get to a judgment, but the capacity to make a decision and do a thing is mostly constrained by sort of social or external forces. Is that sort of a right idea of what you're saying?
I think on a day-to-day basis, that's what it is. That's what I come down to, that you can, the makeup of your brain, of course, is influenced by your genetics and by lots of things. The precise action potentials might be influenced by hormones, by, I don't know, who you're around. But ultimately, precisely what you're thinking now is much, much more to do with the environment that you're in right now, what exactly your thoughts are going to be. And so yes, I think it's very social at the end of the day. It's a very social.
Okay, I sort of worry that idea might lead to a sort of a social determinism, or at least like sort of open the door to a thought of social determinism. So there's lots of social circumstances which can prompt behavior. If I leave a gun on the table, it promotes aggressive or confrontational mindsets. So I'm wondering how you might push back on that. I have 100 who want to.
So I'm not trying to say that, you know, something outside of us is constraining us completely and telling us what to do. No, I am actually saying it's based on the background of all the memories and beliefs you have and the predictions of the future. All of those things are the things that set up the limitations around what you believe. But precisely what you're going to believe within those possibilities is much more governed by right now. There's a gun on the table, what am I going to do about it? I don't think anyone's going to lift it and shoot me, so therefore I'm going to do nothing about it. You know, that those past memories and things that you have in there in predictions are obviously underwriting what you're currently doing and thinking.
Okay, question right at the back, and then,
Oh, I think I've jumped the queue.
yes, you,
Okay.
I
Thank
saw
you.
your hand first, sorry.
Well, thank you very much to all speakers. My question is on free will. I was reading Origin the other day, and he has a big treatise called On Free Will in his sort of foundational treatise on the principles of Christian belief. And he starts this treatise in normal fashion, placing it in the Aristotelian stochastic and Stoic discourse. And then he goes on to discuss aspects of free will, which you might imagine he would, you know, taking things from the Bible and saying, why can God judge us or whatever if we don't have free will? And that's all very fine. But if you look at the title of his talk, his word is autoexousia, which means, doesn't mean free will. It's translated free will, but it means self-control or self-mastery. And I thought in the context of all these environments, neurological, hormonal, whatever else, self-mastery means a rather different thing, doesn't it? And that gives us a rather different idea on what self-will really means.
Yeah, so of course we do want to constrain, we want to be able to constrain how we react to all of our circumstances. And that is part of our upbringing, part of the social circumstances in which you find yourself in. If you were in a different circumstance, you wouldn't mind acting a different way. That's part of what the brain is actually learning. But my definition really of free will came down to the possibility it's not 2 + 2 = 4. It's not that you are constrained by all those environmental inputs. It's not that, it goes beyond that. The brain has now the ability to jump outside of itself, to jump outside of its genetics. We're not simply an evolutionary consequence. We've basically gone beyond that because we have neurons, because we can actually integrate, and because we can think for ourselves. We can move ourselves completely outside of the ape to the human. So that, I think that's what's so special about free will, that it is, you can decide today to do something that is outside of the realms of which you would normally compute. Now, of course, you can't go outside of the relevance of the laws that are actually holding it in. So that means you just can't decide today to go to the moon. There's lots of things that are constraining. That's all.
So, question? Is it for one of the other speakers?
Yes,
Yes,
yeah.
great.
Well, thank you to each of the speakers. Very interesting and stimulating presentations. And the speakers, both as psychologists, special psychologists and Christian. My question is particularly for Daniel. And it relates, Daniel, to the notion of intuition. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what you've said in relation to the notion of intuition, both at an individual level and a collective societal level. And relating that to what you said about folk psychology and this sort of collective, intuitive sort of understanding, or we think we have an understanding of how and why we interrelate or react to the way that we do.
Okay, so one thing about a philosopher, so I'll probably ask you a question right back real quick. With intuition, there's a lot of different uses for intuition. One is that intuition might mean something like intellectual insight or intellectual understanding. So it's the way that you've set up a bunch of math problems on the board, and then finally you understand geometrically what's going on. Another sense of intuition might be related to that, but it's just sort of like your gut feeling, or like what you happen to think about something given the sort of context and circumstances of life. So is it more the first, more the second, or something else?
Well, I'm thinking particularly on an individual level.
Yeah.
I mean, as you said, you know, with the example of, say, them studying the mathematical process, or, you know, it could be the sort of the eureka moment in
Okay.
something, you know, very different from a mathematical process. But it seems to me that it's a very difficult thing to explain or to come to terms with, or in terms of your presentation, to form a model of what actually might be happening in the process, which might involve in what we call intuition.
Yeah, definitely. So one thing about intuition in this sense, I'll use the word insight, because intuition, a lot of philosophers, more means like gut instincts or like reactions, and there's a whole other set of things to say about that. Yeah, absolutely. You have to think at length, as philosophers have, about what you might mean by insight or active understanding and how that would occur. A lot of thinkers would be inclined to think that that would be the grounds for making certain arguments where you're not going to find very clear neural correlates for anything like this, that this is in fact maybe one of many distinctive, uniquely human sort of aspects. And it might be a kind of argument for a sort of dualist view. It might be an argument for another kind of Aristotelian view that just doesn't think in terms of physical and the mental, but thinks of a much more complicated way of the human person. But there's something uniquely human about insight. That said, when you do want to think through insight, you have to connect it up with concepts of knowledge, concepts of understanding and belief, and you're going to find neural correlates of them, but those are going to be, I think, a little bit more trackable, especially something like thinking, where there's actually a temporal duration, it's an event, right? And you can localize and figure out what distributed areas throughout the brain are being activated while someone is thinking through something, and that's going to be the process antecedent to an insight. But setting up a really clear measured examination neurologically for correlates of insight, that's going to be really, really difficult. So I'm sorry that's not very helpful to answer your question, but it's a very challenging, tricky one.
Okay.
Okay.
I also have a question for Daniel. Okay. Thank you for a really great talk. I think you did a great job of dealing with what's a really quite thorny area, this kind of notion of the relationship between neuroscience and psychology. But if I might just play devil's advocate for a moment as a neuroscientist, I think there is a great risk of basically setting up a straw man. My experience is that the vast majority of neuroscientists do know the difference between neuroscientific correlates and psychological states, and they're well aware of the limitations of their discipline. We are all well aware, I think, that the methods we use are incredibly reductionist, they're incredibly simplistic relative to the complexity of the thing we're trying to study, and that the methods we use are really good for answering some very simple questions about how the brain works and its relationship to cognitive states. It's rubbish for addressing other questions. So, for example, James S. McDonald Foundation, in their guidance notes for grant applicants, now says, we will not consider applicants who are proposing to study, for instance, the neurocorrelates of moral decisions, or because the methods that we use in neuroscience are just simply not good enough for addressing those kinds of states that don't work well when you have to reduce everything down to a simple paradigm. And I guess I'm going to a question, which is, do you think that it really is the case that neuroscientists probably are making this mistake? Or is it just the case that it's just one or two? Or is it just sloppy use of language?
So I think it's all of the above, actually. I mean, there's not a cookie cutter neuroscientist, just like there's not a cookie cutter philosopher. You just can't like put up an image and say this is all the things that a philosopher thinks, and you can't put up an image and say this is everything that a neuroscientist thinks. So in my own experience in the lab, which is quite minimal, is that my colleagues think lots of different things about these sort of issues. Some of them are really careful about how they use language. They would never fall into any of these sort of. They wouldn't want to use metaphorically or by literal or any sense. They don't think that the discipline merits using that kind of language, so they're really, really careful. On the other hand, there are people that are well known in the field who publish textbooks and who, I'm attending all these lectures here now in Cambridge in neuroscience, and they do just use sloppy language all the time, and I think a lot of them literally do. I mean, some of them, like Michael Gonzanaga and Roger Sperry, who are huge names in cognitive neuroscience, publishing textbooks both with MIT and others that everyone's reading, and they quite literally mean these sorts of things. So if you've read any
So you think that it's more than just a language, that you can literally believe that...
Yeah, that's, Gonzanaga literally believes that different parts of the hemisphere have their own conscious states, that they have their own sort of beliefs. He thinks that the left hemisphere interpreter module really is what confabulates all the sorts of stories that explain. So while I completely agree with you and applaud anyone who isn't worried about this sort of issue and doesn't have these sorts of problems, on the other hand, these are not just, I mean, Gonzanaga has given the Gifford lectures, he's published books on free will that are popular New York Times bestsellers. So there are people that are doing that. And then it sort of infects the general cultural milieu that we just simply are, our brains. And neuroscientists talk this way, so they've already solved the mind-body problems, and that's why they talk this way.
I wonder if it's an unfortunate consequence that the people who are perhaps a little looser with their language, it has a very intuitive appeal when someone says, oh, you know, your left hemisphere has a such and such conscious state. And as a result, that becomes very popular. It's a nice public lecture to go and listen to.
You're more likely to get headlines.
Yeah, exactly, and get the
so.
prize. Whereas if you're much more constrained and conceptual about how you describe the limits of your methods and so on,
then I have no issues. I mean, I think part of it's just how you're philosophically approaching the way you want to interpret your data and display it. And yeah, so then I have no issue.
There's a question here in the second row.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. McKay. You mentioned in passing that you had some beef with the notion of the hypersensitive agency detection device. And I'd be very interested to know what your beef is, because it's an argument that's used by evolutionary psychologists, many of you are humanistic, to argue for the inevitability of supernatural beliefs amongst humans, and even for God. And it's a very, it's quite different from the sort of Dawkins argument about belief being rubbish. And to me, it seems, in a way, intuitively quite an attractive idea. It's giving a sort of mechanism for why we might have supernatural beliefs. So I'd be really interested to know what you think about it when you said you had some beef with it.
Right, thanks very much for the question. Yeah, so I'm aware, I mean, the person who actually used the language hyperactive agency detection device is Justin Barrett, who's quite a devout Christian, so he's definitely not from the sort of Dawkins-like stable. I guess my problem with the idea, well, for one thing, sometimes people tend to, sometimes it's presented as being a full explanation of religious belief across cultures and whatnot, but it seems to me that it can't possibly explain the kind of rich panoply of cultural traditions that might be referred to as religious or whatnot. I mean, it might be part of it might be one amongst the suite of cognitive mechanisms that predispose humans to find certain ideas like supernatural agency, for instance, attractive. One idea, so the basic logic of hyperactive agency detection is it's an example of a more general evolutionary psychological argument, which is called error management theory. The basic idea of error management theory is that our brains have evolved so as to minimise the costs of different errors that we make, not so as to maximise the accuracy of our beliefs. So if there's any kind of situation where you can make one error rather than another, so the agency idea is that one type of error you could make if you're relaxing in your deck chair outside of your cave, if you're an ancestral human, for instance, and you hear a rustle in the bushes nearby. One kind of error you could make is to assume that there's some kind of malevolent agent rushing towards you when in fact there isn't, and you might leap out and try and take some evasive apparent reaction. The other kind of error is to assume that it's just the wind, and you stay there and someone comes and attacks you. Now the idea is that the second kind of error is altogether more costly in sort of reproductive currency, and thereby we should have evolved mechanisms that make us more likely to make the former kind of error. So we should be oversensitive to any cue of agency. We should be much more likely to mistake a a boulder for a bear than a bear for a boulder, for instance. That's to use Stuart Guthrie's idea. But there's a general problem with error management theory. I'm sorry if this is getting a little bit kind of recondite, this explanation, but it's something I'm personally interested in, and since you asked the question. The basic problem is that you can't, from the logic of error management theory, which encompasses this hyperactive agency detection device, you can't, the idea that we will have biased beliefs in different domains doesn't automatically fall out of that logic. It could be that we have Bayesian beliefs, perfectly accurate beliefs that integrate the evidence in the rationally optimal way, but that we have a biased decision threshold for action. So the hyperactive agency detection idea is an example of a kind of an idea where we have a supposed cognitive bias. We believe that there are agents present when in fact there are not, but there's no need to posit the existence of biased beliefs when a biased action threshold will do the trick. I'm sorry if that's, I don't want to go into it too much, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. It's a question that I'm very interested in, but that's my answer.
Okay, thank you very much.
Go to the back there, please.
So I have a question about free will to the first speaker. I would like to ask, do you think that there are any choices that are free, that is not constrained by deterministic processes? And if yes, then how do you think this is possible?
Well, I think you can answer that question on several different levels. At one level, everything is constrained by the neurological processing that we have. We have certain inputs, we give certain outputs. If we were dead, we would have no outputs. So we have to take in information. So everything is being constrained. So I think I can give you, that's just a simple answer to it. But what you really want to ask is, in our belief in God, for instance, is that constrained? Is that constrained by our past? Is it constrained by what the Bible tells us? Is it constrained by other things? Yes, that's constrained too. So I can't think of an example. Maybe you can? Just not constrained? I can't.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. My question is on plasticity. You mentioned about plasticity, synapse, and connections. I really wonder, is there any link or connections between LTP, long-term potential in the hippocampus, and plasticity?
You obviously know something about plasticity. So, yes, of course, that's one of the molecular correlates of plasticity. I only mentioned one, is the actual formation of synapses that you can actually look at in the developing mouse brain or in the developing human brain. You can see these things happening. Now, as in later life, you can actually look for changes in neuronal connections, and one of these is in the hippocampus, where people have done this in the mouse brain, where they can, if you give a stimulus, a prior stimulus, and give another stimulus, you can either get an increase in the responsiveness of those neurons, which is long-term potentiation, or you can get a decrease depending on what that prior stimulus was. You can get a decrease in the responsiveness. So in other words, that's just an absolute molecular correlate of how we change in response to something that has happened before. And this was described by a guy in Mill Hill, Tim Bliss, many years ago, who never got any prizes or anything that I know of for an absolutely fundamental molecular mechanism within the brain. So yes, it has something to do with plasticity. It's just one aspect of it.
So the plasticity can be everywhere in the brain? Or?
Oh yeah, everywhere in the brain. It's primarily studied in the hippocampus. It's been found in other places, but it should be everywhere. We're not precisely sure what exactly it is. That's all. You increased production of some proteins have led you to get a synapse, or has the synapse just strengthened itself? It's a bigger synapse, more responsiveness or less responsiveness. So there's lots of questions where it occurs. But that's only one molecular
question from ignorance, as I must distinction between reliance on evidence and experience in the case of these delusions. Sort of over-reliance on an intuitive response to and under-reliance on evidence, rational evidence, perhaps from external.
Sorry, I'm not sure I exactly understand your question. Would you mind just repeating? You're making a distinction between different types of evidence, sensory evidence and perhaps evidence of testimony, for instance, or?
Yeah. Evidence presented by other people in terms of the logic of how you should think about what you've experienced.
Okay, that's a very nice question, actually. Evidence, and that's partly because I wanted to avoid this thorny topic of what evidence actually is, I guess.
It always comes back to bite you, doesn't it?
Yeah, but you said one last question before lunch, I thought I'd nearly got there. Yeah, so I mean, there are different types of evidence. Sensory evidence is one type, but there are, so if you're somebody who is claiming that you've got bees inside your head, for instance, you're going to come into conflict with your family and your friends and with clinicians who will be trying to sort of disabuse you of this idea. So they're providing a different kind of evidence. So my idea has to, my argument has to deal with this objection that if someone's saying that they've got bees in their head, and if I'm saying that they're over-responding to evidence, if they're immediately met with clinicians who say it's not possible to have bees in your head, then my theory should predict that they should immediately accommodate that evidence and switch away from the idea that they've got bees in their head. I think that's a nice objection. I've got a couple of ways of responding to it. One way of responding to it is actually that the way that delusions are characterised clinically is that they're strikingly resistant to evidence, but in fact many delusions kind of wax and wane. This stereotype of deluded individuals as being incredibly firmly set and never deviating from their beliefs is actually that's not quite true clinically. But also, I guess my argument would be that in these kinds of cases that I presented, the bees in the head case, for instance, the mirror case, for instance, the dominant evidence is actually going to be the sensory evidence, because that's going to be omnipresent. Someone with a really bad case of tinnitus is going to have this buzzing sound going on virtually constantly. Occasionally they'll have people saying, well, you can't have bees in your head, so there's another kind of evidence coming into the mix. But considered as a whole, and this is where you have to try and weigh up different kinds of evidence or whatnot. My argument would be that the most prominent, most salient evidence in their amongst the different forms of evidence they're receiving is this sensory experience. I don't have any real way of quantifying of evidence in this way, but that's what my argument would be. And then if that's coupled with a propensity to overweight the contents of your current experience, then you'll end up with this delusion. Thanks for the question. It's a very good question.